Most of us were taught that the Treaty of Versailles caused the Second World War. A hall of mirrors at Versailles in June 1919, a German delegation with no power to argue, a bill so enormous it broke the German economy, wheelbarrows of banknotes in the streets, a humiliated nation, and 17 years later German troops marching back into the Rhineland while the men who wrote the treaty watched. That version is not exactly false. It is something more dangerous than false. It is a true sentence with the machinery taken out of it, because the reparations bill that mattered was not the one in the headlines. The famous figure, 132 billion gold marks, was the nominal legal total, but not the amount Germany was ever expected to service in practice. The operative portion came to 50 billion. Germany eventually transferred less than half of that. And here's the fact that ought to stop the standard story in its tracks. In the years when Germany was supposedly being bled white by reparations, more capital flowed into Germany from American investors than flowed out of Germany to its former enemies. So if the burden was smaller than we were told, and the money was arriving as fast as it left, why does the connection between Versailles and Hitler feel so obvious? Because it is real, just not where you were told to look for it. The treaty did help fuel the Second World War. It did it not by bankrupting Germany in 1921. The reparations system built around it evolved into a machine that transmitted a collapse in American credit into German politics 8 years later. And it did it by handing every nationalist in the country a permanent argument that any German government which paid its bills was committing treason. 2 leading Republican statesmen tied to the armistice and to the policy of paying were murdered by the far right. Here is what this video will show you. A bond series worth 82 billion gold marks that every negotiator in the room understood would never be collected. A man who signed an armistice and was hunted through a forest for it. A country whose reparations payments were suspended in 1931 and effectively ended in 1932, more than 6 months before Hitler took power, and which got him anyway. And a reparations-era bond whose final deferred interest payment did not fall due until 2010. So let's go back, not to 1919 and the Hall of Mirrors, but to 1917 and a set of loans that nobody in the story could afford to forgive. The First World War was financed heavily through borrowing, though taxation still covered part of the cost. Every major belligerent issued debt, and as the war ground on, the international credit chain increasingly ended in one place. Britain and France financed their own allies while borrowing heavily themselves. Britain lent to France, France lent to Russia and Italy, and behind all of them, after 1917, stood the United States Treasury. By the armistice, the American Treasury had advanced roughly $8 billion to Allied government. Post-war credits pushed the principal toward $9.5 billion, and interest carried the obligation past $10 billion. Set that against what Washington was used to spending. The entire annual budget of the United States federal government before the war was $726 million. In 19 months, the Americans had lent something close to 10 times what they used to spend in a year. Britain came out of the war, still a creditor to much of Europe, but deeply indebted to the United States and no longer the unrivaled financial power it had been in 1914. France had lost its richest industrial departments to occupation and had financed the war almost entirely on credit. Much of it lent to a Russian government that no longer existed and had repudiated everything the Tsar signed. So the men who sat down to write the peace were not simply victors deciding what justice required. They were finance ministers with holes in their national accounts, and each of them had a domestic public that had been promised repeatedly and in writing that the enemy would pay for the war. Now think about what that means for the peace conference. Britain and France arrived at Versailles as victors and as debtors. They owed Washington enormous sums, and Washington had made its position clear and never really moved from it. The debts were commercial obligations. They would be repaid. They had nothing to do with reparations. That American position is the hinge of the entire interwar period, and it is almost always left out. Because if the Allies had to pay America, the Allies had to be paid by somebody. In 1922, the British government said so out loud in a document called the Balfour Note, which announced that Britain would seek from Germany and from its own allies no more than what Britain itself owed to the United States. It was an offer of restraint. It was also a public admission of the chain. Germany pays France and Britain pay America. Every negotiator at Versailles knew that chain existed. The reparations clauses were not shaped by physical destruction alone. They were shaped by pensions, by wartime promises to voters, by domestic politics, and by the debts the victors themselves had to service. All of which leads to the most misunderstood sentence in modern diplomatic history. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles is known to almost everyone as the War Guilt Clause. It has been taught that way for a century, and the label is a distortion, applied first and most effectively by the people it was used against. The article does not use the word guilt. It does not appear anywhere in the text. What it does is establish that Germany and its allies were responsible for causing the loss and damage of the war. and it exists as the opening of a chapter about money. Its function is legal, and its companion article, Article 232, immediately concedes that the resources of Germany are not adequate to make complete reparation and narrows the categories of damage that can be claimed. Read together, one article establishes liability, and the next one admits Germany cannot meet it in full and limits what may be counted. German governments across the political spectrum seized on that article and translated it into moral condemnation. It worked so well that English-speaking historians adopted the German framing and taught it to their own students for 2 generations. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to slide from that correction into an apology for the treaty, and the treaty does not deserve one. Germany lost 13% of its European territory, and somewhere between 6.5 and 7 million people. It lost every colony. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. Conscription banned, submarines forbidden, air force abolished. The Rhineland was occupied and demilitarized. These were real humiliations imposed on a real country, and the Germans themselves had done considerably worse when they held the pen. In March 1918, at Brest-Litovsk, Germany imposed on a defeated Russia the loss of 1/3 of its population, half its industry, and 9/10 of its coal mines. The men who called Versailles a Carthaginian peace had drafted one themselves 15 months earlier. Now to the number. Because the number is where the myth lives, and because this is the point at which the story you were told and the story in the archives stopped describing the same event, the Treaty of Versailles did not set the final reparations total. It could not agree on one. It did require an interim payment of 20 billion gold marks by the 1st of May 1921. Germany was credited with far less than that, and much of what was actually realized went to the cost of the occupying armies and to essential food and raw materials. The final sum was left to a commission, and on the 5th of May 1921, the commission delivered it as an ultimatum with a 6-day deadline in the London schedule of payments. Germany accepted on the 11th. The total was 132 billion gold marks. That figure went around the world and has stayed in circulation ever since. But the schedule divided the debt into 3 series of bonds, and the division is everything. The A bonds were 12 billion gold marks. The B bonds were 38 billion. Those 2 series were real. They carried interest, they carried a payment schedule, and Germany was expected to service them. The C bonds were 82 billion gold marks. They were created and handed to the Reparation Commission without coupons attached, and they were never released into circulation. They could be activated only if the Commission concluded that Germany was able to service them, and the A and B bonds had absolute priority over anything the C bonds might one day represent. The historian Sally Marks, whose work on this subject demolished more textbook paragraphs than almost any article of its generation, called the C bonds chimerical and entirely unreal. Her judgment is blunt. They were a device to satisfy public opinion in Britain and France, where voters had been promised that Germany would pay for everything, while the actual negotiators worked to a much smaller number. That number was 50 billion gold marks. So the bill that supposedly crushed Germany was, in its real portion, 38% of the figure everyone quotes, and Germany did not pay that either. Across the entire period from 1920 to 1932, German payments came to a little over 20 billion gold marks, in cash and in kind, in coal and timber and railway rolling stock, roughly 1/6 of the famous headline, roughly 40% of the real obligation. Here is where the story gets strange, because that underpayment was not simply German evasion, and it was not simply Allied leniency. It was the product of a machine that had been assembled almost by accident out of American money. But before the machine could begin turning, there was a confrontation. In January 1923, after Germany had failed for the 34th time in 36 months to deliver a scheduled installment of reparations coal, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley and occupied Germany's industrial heartland. The German government could not fight. It chose passive resistance, the option its cabinet judged most politically survivable. Workers in the Ruhr were told to do nothing that helped the occupation. The mines and factories of the most productive region in Europe went still, and the German government paid those idle workers by printing money. This is the moment that produced the images everyone remembers. Children building towers from bricks of banknotes. A wheelbarrow of paper for a loaf of bread. Workers paid twice a day so they could spend the morning's wages before the afternoon's prices arrived. Restaurants that stopped printing menus because the numbers went stale between courses. By November 1923, $1 American was worth over 4 trillion German marks. In mid-November, the Rentenmark was introduced, 12 zeros were struck off, and the nightmare stopped almost as suddenly as it had started. Now, the standard story says reparations caused that hyperinflation. Look closely at the sequence, and something more uncomfortable appears. Actual cash reparations transfers during the hyperinflation years were small. The printing presses were running to pay German workers to not work in a confrontation the German government had chosen as a strategy. And after 1924, when Germany began paying reparations on a far larger scale than in 1923, there was no hyperinflation at all. Reparations created the confrontation. They did not mechanically produce the hyperinflation. The mark had been weakened for years, by the way. Germany financed the war itself on deficits in paper rather than taxes. Financing passive resistance through the printing press finished what wartime borrowing had started, none of which makes the Ruhr occupation justified, or France blameless, or Germany's options good. It means the causal story most of us carry, treaty to bill, to hyperinflation, to Hitler, has a step in it the evidence does not support. A government finished off a currency its own war finance had already crippled in order to win a political argument about a debt. The distinction matters because the first version makes Germany a passive victim of arithmetic. The second version puts a German cabinet in the room making a choice, and it is the second version the documents support. What came next is the part of this history that almost no one is taught, and it is the part that makes the collapse of 1929 comprehensible. The Ruhr occupation had proved that the existing arrangement did not work for anybody. So in 1924, a committee under the American banker Charles Dawes rebuilt it. The Dawes Plan rescheduled German payments on a rising scale, reorganized the German currency and central bank, and got French and Belgian troops out of the Ruhr. It was accompanied by an international loan of 800 million gold marks, roughly $200 million. J.P. Morgan led the American tranche, and demand ran far past the amount on offer. Dawes received the Nobel Peace Prize the following year, and with that loan, the machine started turning. American investors lent to German cities, German utilities, German industry. Germany used foreign exchange to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used those receipts to service their war debts to the United States. The dollars went out of New York, traveled through Berlin, Paris, and London, and came home. Picture it as one circuit. A dentist in Ohio buys a German municipal bond because it pays better than anything at home. Berlin uses that foreign exchange to make a reparations transfer to Paris. Paris forwards it to Washington as a war debt installment, and the Treasury books it as revenue. Nobody in that circuit was behaving irrationally. Each of them was meeting an obligation or seeking a yield. But the arrangement had one property nobody designed and everybody depended on. It only worked while the first man kept buying. The Young Plan of 1929, chaired by Owen Young of General Electric, formalized the arrangement, reduced the total, stretched the payments out for another 58 years, and created a new institution in Basel to handle the transfers, the Bank for International Settlements, which still exists. Now consider what this means for the ledger, and this is the finding that overturns the popular story completely. The American historian Stephen Schuker examined the capital accounts of the period and reached a conclusion he stated in his title: what happened between 1919 and 1933 was, on net, American reparations to Germany. German payments out were more than offset by American capital coming in, much of it never repaid after 1933. Germany, in the aggregate, imported more capital than it exported during the reparations era. On a net capital flow basis, American lending to Germany exceeded Germany's reparations transfers out. In that limited but real sense, American investors were financing the circuit, and most of them had no idea that was what they were doing. That sounds like an argument that reparations did no harm at all. It is not, and here is where I have to be more careful than the popular story on either side. A payment system sustained by continuous new borrowing is not self-supporting. It is dependent. Every year the arrangement continued, Germany's ability to meet its obligations rested on the willingness of American investors to keep buying German bonds. That willingness was not a natural feature of the universe. It was a market condition, and market conditions end. New American lending to Germany had already begun to weaken by 1928. Then, in October 1929, the New York stock market crashed, and a retreat turned into a reversal. In May 1931, the Creditanstalt, the largest bank in Austria, collapsed, and the panic swept through Central Europe. The lending that had kept the machine turning simply stopped. What was left was the obligation. Under the Young Plan, Germany's reparations payments were no longer cushioned by an inflow of foreign money. They had become a hard claim on the German balance of payments, in a country whose exports were collapsing, along with world trade. The economic historian Albrecht Ritschl has argued that the balance of payments stabilization required by the Young Plan explains most of the fall in German national product during the Depression. On his reading, the deflation that followed was not ideological stubbornness. It was an austerity reaction to an imminent foreign debt crisis. That austerity has a name, and his name is Heinrich Brüning, chancellor from March 1930, governing largely by emergency decree because he could not command a majority. Brüning cut and cut and cut. Nominal government spending fell by roughly a quarter. Because prices were collapsing at the same time, the cut in real terms was smaller, closer to a tenth. It was still the wrong direction, applied for 2 years, into a collapse. Income tax rates rose. 4 emergency decrees slashed welfare payments, pensions, health spending, education, and the salaries of civil servants. He did this into the worst economic contraction in modern German history. Registered unemployment, which had stood at about 1.4 million in 1928, reached 5.6 million by 1932, depending on which workforce you measure against. That is between 1 German worker in 6 and something close to 1 in 3. And there is a reading of Brüning's policy, held by serious historians, that makes it worse rather than better. He was not only balancing a budget, he was demonstrating something. By driving the German economy into the ground while continuing to meet reparations obligations, he was building the case that reparations were unpayable in order to have them canceled. If that was the strategy, it worked. In June 1931, President Hoover declared a 1-year moratorium on all intergovernmental payments. In July 1932, at the Lausanne Conference, the Allies effectively canceled German reparations, retaining only a token final payment that was never made. It also worked in another way, and this is the sentence this entire video exists to deliver. We now have statistical evidence on what that austerity did to German politics. The economists Gregory Galofre, Weiler, Christopher Meissner, Martin McKee, and David Stuckler studied the Weimar elections district by district and found that the German towns and regions hit hardest by the cuts were the ones where the Nazi vote rose fastest. In the working paper version of their study, each 1 standard deviation increase in fiscal consolidation was associated with a rise of well over 2 percentage points in the Nazi vote between September 1930 and July 1932. Look at what the Nazi vote actually did. In May 1928, the party took 2.6%, a fringe of a fringe. In September 1930, after the Depression arrived and the decrees began, 18.3%. In July 1932, at the depth of the austerity, 37.3%, and the largest party in the Reichstag. And then, in November 1932, the Nazi vote fell. 33.1%, down 4 points, 34 seats lost, the party in debt and quarreling with itself. Hold that fact, because it is the one almost nobody is taught. Hitler was appointed chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, 10 weeks after his party's support had gone into decline. He did not win his way into power on a rising tide. He was handed it by a small circle of conservatives who believed they could use him at the moment he was weakest. There was one more election in March 1933, and the party took 43.9%. But that one belongs in a different category, and I will not put it in the same sequence without saying so. By then, Hitler was already chancellor, the Reichstag had burned, civil liberties had been suspended by decree, thousands of communists were in jail, and stormtroopers were standing outside polling stations. That is not a measurement of persuasion. Now hold 2 dates side by side. Reparations were canceled in July 1932. Adolf Hitler became chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. The bill was already dead. He came anyway. That single fact destroys the crude version of the story, in which reparations directly bankrupted Germany into fascism. And it reveals the mechanism that actually operated, which is stranger and harder to teach. Reparations did not need to be paid to do their political work. They needed only to exist, to be blamed, and to be enforced through domestic hardship. All of it converges on 2 men most people have never heard of, whose deaths tell you more about how Versailles fed the Second World War than any figure in this video. Matthias Erzberger was a Catholic politician of the German Center Party, a man of the moderate right, and it was Erzberger who signed the armistice in the railway carriage at Compiègne in November 1918. He signed because someone had to, and the generals would not. He then served as finance minister and pushed through a tax reform that centralized German public finance. On the 26th of August 1921, while walking in the Black Forest, he was shot dead by 2 former naval officers belonging to a clandestine organization called Organisation Consul. The killers escaped abroad and lived for years in comfortable exile. 10 months later, on the 24th of June 1922, Walther Rathenau, industrialist, philosopher, foreign minister, and a Jew, was ambushed in his car on the way to work in Berlin. Gunmen sprayed the vehicle and threw in a grenade. They too were from Organisation Consul. Hundreds of thousands came out in Berlin for Rathenau's funeral, and millions more across Germany stopped work to market, and the Reichstag passed a law for the protection of the Republic within weeks. Neither the crowd nor the law changed the incentive that had produced the killing. To his killers, Rathenau's Jewish identity, his republicanism, and his support for a particular policy made him a single symbolic enemy. That policy had a name. It was called fulfillment. The idea was to comply with the treaty as fully as Germany could manage in order to demonstrate to the world, honestly and by performance, that the terms were beyond the country's capacity, and so, to get them revised, it was arguably the most intelligent strategy available to a defeated power. It required a functioning state, an honest accounting, and patience. These were not isolated crimes. Between 1919 and 1922, the statistician Emil Gumbel counted 354 political murders committed by the German right and 22 by the left. 326 of the right-wing killings went unpunished. 4 of the left-wing ones did. Organization Consul carried out the most famous of them, aimed at what the German right called the November criminals, the men held responsible for the armistice and everything that followed. Read those two ratios again, because together they describe a country in which one kind of political murder was effectively legal. And the campaign taught every German politician who came after a simple and devastating lesson. Cooperating with the treaty could get you killed. That is the transmission belt, not a balance of payments. A political market in which the reasonable option carried a physical risk and the extreme option carried a reward. Every year, the reparations question stayed open. That market operated. Every payment schedule renegotiated. Every French soldier in the Rhineland. Every emergency decree signed to keep the country creditworthy was raw material for the argument that the Republic was a machine for serving foreigners. Hitler did not need reparations to be crushing. He needed them to be present. This is the part that is hard to teach, because there is no villain holding a bag of money. The mechanism is not extraction. It is humiliation, with a payment schedule attached, running long enough that a whole generation grows up inside it. Now, the argument among historians, because this is one of the great running battles in modern history, and it deserves to be laid out properly rather than settled by assertion. It begins with a book. In 1919, a young Treasury official who had walked out of the peace conference in disgust published The Economic Consequences of the Peace. John Maynard Keynes argued that the reparations demands were beyond Germany's capacity, that the treaty made no provision for European economic recovery, and that the settlement would produce disaster. The book was a sensation, sold enormously, and shaped English-speaking opinion for decades. It was also, in important respects, wrong, and the demolition came from a Frenchman who did not live to see it published. Etienne Mantoux, killed in action in the last days of the Second World War, wrote The Carthaginian Peace, or The Economic Consequences of Mr. Keynes, published in 1946. Mantoux went through Keynes's forecasts one by one and showed how many had failed. Then he pointed to what he considered the decisive evidence. The same German economy Keynes had described as incapable of paying reparations went on, under Hitler, to fund a rearmament program vastly larger than anything the treaty had demanded. That is a serious argument, and the standard objection to it is equally serious. Rearmament was financed domestically by a dictatorship with control over wages, prices, and capital, and it ended in national ruin. Paying reparations meant transferring real resources across a border in foreign currency in an international economy that was collapsing. The two are not the same problem. Sally Marks then reframed the debate in 1978 with the analysis this video has drawn on, that the headline figure was theater, that the real burden was moderate, and that the German refusal to pay was substantially a political choice. Her critics reply that a burden which is technically affordable can still be politically impossible. The evidence already introduced helps reconcile the dispute. Marx is right that the operative burden was not economically impossible. Ritschl is right that by 1930 it had become economically devastating. Both describe the same obligation, because what changed was not the size of the debt, but the world it had to be paid in. A mortgage you can afford on a salary becomes ruinous the week you lose the job, and the mortgage did not move. And notice what none of them dispute. The 132 billion headline was not the operative obligation. Germany paid roughly a sixth of it. American lending sustained the payments. Reparations were canceled before Hitler took office. Districts hit hardest by austerity saw the largest increases in the Nazi vote, and reparations transfers alone do not explain that pattern. The disagreement is about weighting, not about facts. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the chain runs from a loan agreement in 1917 to a chancellery in Berlin in January 1933. A group of victorious powers arrived at the peace conference already deep in debt to the United States, which declined to forgive what it was owed, and so they wrote a treaty that required somebody else to pay. A liability clause written by lawyers as the doorway to a financial chapter was successfully reframed by German propaganda as a confession of guilt and became the most hated sentence in the country. A reparations total was published at more than double the operative obligation, so that voters in London and Paris would believe they had been made whole, which meant the number that entered German politics was a number no one intended to collect. A confrontation over coal deliveries in 1923 led a German government to pay millions of workers to stop working, which destroyed the currency and wiped out the savings of the German middle class in a matter of months. A rebuilt settlement in 1924 made reparations payable in practice through continuous American capital inflows, which meant German solvency now depended on the mood of the New York bond market. That market closed in 1929, and the obligation remained, and a chancellor governing by decree chose to meet it by cutting nominal spending by roughly a quarter into a depression that put more than 5.5 million Germans out of work. And every step of that sequence, from the occupation of the Ruhr to the last emergency decree, gave a movement of the far right the same argument, delivered to an audience that grew larger every year. Any one of these produces a crisis. Assembled in order, they produce a country in which the extreme option looks like the only untried one. Consider what that looked like at the level of a single household. A German family with savings in 1914 was, by the standards of the time, secure. Government war bonds were patriotic and safe. By late 1923, those bonds and those savings were worth nothing whatsoever. Not reduced, not devalued, erased. That family rebuilt in the middle years of the decade, when the American money was flowing. Then the father lost his job in 1931. The unemployment insurance he had paid into was cut by emergency decree, and his parents' pension was cut by the same decree. Twice in a decade, a whole class of careful, thrifty, law-abiding Germans watched everything they had built disappear through mechanisms they could not see and had never voted for. In 1928, that family had almost certainly not voted for the Nazi Party, because almost nobody had. By 1932, it was one of the most likely groups in Germany to do so. That is what the numbers in this video mean when you stand close enough to see one family. And notice that neither of the two catastrophes that hit them was a reparations payment. The first was a currency destroyed by their own government during a confrontation over reparations. The second was an austerity program adopted to keep the country creditworthy while reparations were still nominally owed. In both cases, the treaty is in the room, and in neither case is it the hand doing the damage. And this is where the history stops being safely historical. The specific instruments are gone. Nobody today is arguing about gold marks or C-bonds. The structure is not gone at all. It appears whenever an external obligation, owed by one government to others, can only be met by imposing hardship on people who had no part in incurring it. The debt is negotiated between finance ministries. The adjustment happens in hospitals, schools, and pension offices. The politics that follows belongs to whoever is willing to say the whole arrangement is a fraud committed by foreigners and their local servant. I am not drawing an equivalence between any modern country and Weimar Germany, and nobody should. The story is not that history repeats. The story is that this particular machine has been built more than once, on several continents, and we have a fairly good record of what comes out of it. The next time someone tells you that the Treaty of Versailles caused the Second World War, you will know what is missing from that sentence. Not the treaty, which was real and harsh. What is missing is the mechanism. Versailles did not fund Hitler by taking money out of Germany. It fueled him by creating a permanent grievance that no German government could resolve. It fueled him by making German solvency dependent on foreign lenders, who eventually went home. And it fueled him by ensuring that when the money stopped, the pain of the adjustment would land on the people least able to bear it and most able to vote. The bill was survivable, the structure was not. That is the story underneath the story you were taught. Not a nation crushed by a number, but a republic asked to spend 14 years proving its loyalty to an arrangement its own citizens had been told was a crime, in a currency it had to borrow from strangers. And every part of it was chosen, in rooms, by named men, who could have chosen otherwise and mostly knew it. There is one last detail, and I have saved it because it says something no argument can. Versailles itself did not stay collectible for 91 years. Reparations were suspended in 1931 and killed at Lausanne in 1932. But the financial machinery built around them outlived the thing it was built to serve. On the 3rd of October 2010, Germany transferred about 70 million euros, not an installment on the 132 billion mark assessment. Deferred interest on foreign bonds issued under the Dawes and Young plans, the loans that had kept the reparations circuit turning. Germany serviced those bonds in some markets until war broke out in 1939. The London Debt Agreement of 1953 restructured the debt and deferred part of the back interest until reunification. Reunification came in 1990. The last funding bonds matured 20 years later. The reparations regime was long gone. A debt instrument built to keep it running was still alive, and it outlasted every man who designed it. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. This channel reads the ledgers underneath the stories you were told, and there are a great many ledgers left. And tell me in the comments which link in this chain you think mattered most. The American refusal to cancel the war debts, the published figure that nobody intended to collect, the murder of the men who tried to comply, or the decision to meet a foreign obligation by raising taxes and cutting deep into nominal spending in the middle of a depression. I read every single one. If you got something out of this, A like helps this video reach people who were only ever told that the treaty was too harsh.